Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this panel called Turkey and Its Neighbors. My name is Damir Marušić. I'm executive editor at the American Interest magazine. I'm also a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, where I work on the Western Balkans. It's my real pleasure to be joined by a really elite panel, which I will introduce in 1 second. Just a few words sort of opening to try and situate this discussion. In Washington, it's notable to me how Turkey has both recently been a source of great concern in terms of geopolitics. It's sort of the drift in the relationship with the United States in particular, but in the broader West more generally, in its growing closeness to Russia in particular, both in terms of its energy cooperation and in terms of geopolitics and security cooperation. But also, and I think you'll hear this from the panel, in terms of political trends at home, growing authoritarianism. And at the same time, when I work on the Western Balkans, I notice among experts that when we talk about challenges to that particular region, Russia comes up first. China, is also playing a role, but Turkey's active and oftentimes positive role in its neighborhood is ignored. So to help me talk through this, it's a massive subject, and we'll try and get to this since we're running late quickly and open it up to questions. Let me introduce the panel here with me. We have Ambassador Matthew Bryza. He's been a U.S. diplomat for 23 years, and his final assignment was in Azerbaijan. He is currently working with several firms in Turkey in the energy sector. We have next to him Marietje Schaake, who was until recently a member of European Parliament. She's an expert in digital and cyber affairs and the rule of law. Next to her, we have Ambassador Fatma Yazgan, who is the Turkey's ambassador. Yes, sorry, Ambassador Fatma Çetin Yazgan, who has served in Turkey's Ministry of Foreign Affairs for 26 years. She's been in Moscow, in Kiev, in Muscat, and she is currently the ambassador here in Georgia. I have next to me Mr. David Merkel, who is also with the Atlantic Council, and he's the managing director of Summit International Advisors, and he also has a long and distinguished career in the Foreign Service and in the U.S. government, and deep also experience in this region here. And over there at the far side is Ambassador Clint Williamson, who's Senior Director for International Rule of Law, Governance, and Security Studies at McCain Institute. And he himself also has a long and distinguished career in the government and has spent some time in the Western Balkans. So a lot to talk about. Ambassador Bryza, if I could have you sort of set the scene for us about U.S.-Turkey relations, the current sort of state of play, and I'd also like everyone to think about and what now. So not just analyzing the status, but looking forward. Which way are we going?
Great. Thank you very much, Damir. One of the best things about living in Turkey is it's right next to Georgia. And boy, I really feel that more than ever this trip. It really feels like being home here. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone's here, all of our friends for the past several decades, Nino and Nino and all the Ninos that have made this really an amazing event. Yeah, U.S.-Turkey relations are worse than I've ever experienced, or I've ever observed. I don't experience them now, but worse than I've ever observed. And it's in a way strategically ridiculous that we're at this point. The misperceptions on each side are profound, and we're totally misaligned right after the coup attempt 3 years ago. At that time, the conventional wisdom in Washington largely was not sure it was really a coup attempt, right? Not sure, though we're unhappy, whatever it was, that it didn't succeed. There was some talk in some U.S. military circles that maybe things would have been better had then Prime Minister Erdogan been gone. And it was a bit late before the U.S. administration then, President Obama came out and said, our NATO ally has a democratically elected leader. We may not like him. We may like him. Doesn't matter. He's democratically elected. And thank goodness the coup didn't succeed. It took a while for that to come out. So that led to misperceptions in Turkey, I think across the political spectrum, that the U.S. must then have been involved in the coup, especially when the person who planned it has residency in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania, and his organization actually carried it out. If I'm sounding polemical, I'm telling you what I believe. I believe from my own experience, my family's experience, the Gulenists came after us, and we had to flee Turkey at a certain point. That's a story I can tell you on the sidelines. So from my perspective, thank God the coup didn't succeed, but even my Western-educated business partner went to Boston University. His family business was a joint venture with Dodge manufacturing trucks. He looked funny at me the Monday after the coup attempt and said, well, actually, where were you on Saturday? You know, are you somehow involved because of my government past? So what a remarkable misalignment in visions, not just in governments, but also in the expert communities. And I said it's ridiculous that we got there because, well, the topic of this panel is Turkey and its neighbors. Think of who its neighbors are, besides Georgia. I mean, it's Armenia, with whom Turkey has no relationship. It's Russia. It's not Azerbaijan, but the cliche is Turkey and Azerbaijan are one nation and two states, so Azerbaijan's sort of a neighbor. So Turkey is a Caucasian country. Turkey is a Black Sea country, and by extension, it has neighborly relations with Russia, with Ukraine, with Romania by extension, with Bulgaria. Turkey is a Balkan country, and if you look back at Ottoman history, sort of the ambassador may disagree with me, but the center of gravity, sort of culturally, strategically of the Ottoman Empire was the Balkans. And then finally, Turkey is partially or largely a Middle Eastern country. So it's the Middle Eastern component, I think, where we really got terribly off track. It began on March 1st, 2003, when the U.S. requested permission to liberate Iraq via Turkey. And the Turkish parliament said no. I remember the moment it happened, I had this image in the back of my mind of an airplane on fire, but nobody knows it yet, and it's about to crash. Because U.S.-Turkey relations were on the verge of becoming, I thought, on the top shelf of U.S. strategic importance, together maybe with the UK, if Turkey had said yes. Our interdependence would have been so deep. The level of cooperation that we were negotiating bilaterally was going to be so extensive. But then when the no came, I could feel that is all going to collapse and everything's going to change. And I remember telling the Turkish ambassador, Faruk Lolu, at the time in Washington, oh my God, the problem is not the U.S. is going to retaliate. The problem is the U.S. isn't going to care. It's going to turn away. And so that process began. Simultaneously, as Minister Lajcak was saying, Turkey became seen as a problem that wanted to be fixed through EU membership. Turkish side would say the door was never fully open. EU would say, well, it never was serious about fulfilling all the criteria. So we drifted for a while. A big part of it was another Turkish neighbor, Cyprus. So I'm going to wrap it up in just a moment, but I consider Cyprus a quasi-Middle East country as well. So sort of the fuse for the debacle in U.S.-Turkey relations began with March 1st, 2003. It kind of simmered in a negative way for a while. All at a time when we were so disappointed, many people in the West thought Turkey was going to be, they would say a model, Turks hated that, but an example of how a secular society with a Muslim majority, even soft Islamist government, could provide an inspiration for other countries in the region that had once been part of the Ottoman Empire and had gone through previous experiences at reform, driven by the Ottoman Sultan then. The Tanzimat period would be one in the 1840s. So where are we now and what now? What now is I think we need to recalibrate and figure out how we realign our perceptions. I think we are so off base in Syria. From Turkey's perspective, it's mind-boggling that the U.S. has chosen the YPG Kurdish militia as its partner. YPG, in my book, is an affiliate of the PKK. The PKK is a designated terrorist organization by the U.S., by the EU. So it's difficult to comprehend in Ankara how that could be the case. In Washington, it's not so difficult to comprehend. Washington thinks we requested a bunch of Turkish troops to go into Syria. Turkey didn't provide the number we needed, so we had to rely on the YPG. That's a grave oversimplification based on my own experience, but that's the narrative that's out there. So Turkey turned a bit to Russia and Iran through the Astana process, right, which is, I think, a competing forum to the UN process for trying to restore some semblance of civilization in Syria. Again, in my experience with dealing with Turkish officials at the very highest level, they're not happy being alone in the Middle East with Russia and Iran. Again, look back at Turkish history, Ottoman history. Turkey has fought more wars with Russia than any other country, and they usually didn't work out to the advantage of Turkey. And Turkey, throughout how many centuries, was focused on the Persian Empire, containing Persian influence, and containing Russian influence to the south. So Turkey, I think, is engaged in this relationship with Russia and Iran kind of as second choice. I sense there's no desire by Turkey to leave the NATO alliance, although that discussion pops up from time to time. And wrapping it up, Turkey is home to 3.6 million refugees. 3.6 million. Between the 15th of July and 15th of August this year, about 10,500 new refugees entered Turkey. Wow. There's the agreement between the EU and Turkey. Okay, it seems like Turkey has maybe relaxed its implementation of that. Ambassador will disagree with me. But I can tell you, I know from where our summer house is on the coast of Turkey, looking at Greece, in the last year, Turkey has built a Coast Guard command center. It's got a Coast Guard cutter and a naval warship constantly patrolling 24 hours a day to try to live up to that agreement. So what now? Maybe we both, on both sides of the Atlantic or both sides of the Turkish, Greek, and Bulgarian borders, need to take stock of how we got to where we are and how misaligned our perceptions are, and then get back on points.
Thanks, Ambassador. Marietta, could you give us a little bit on the European perspective? Has this, do you agree with Ambassador Breise's general timeline? Is this the relationship with Europe? Has it gone sour sooner or later? Other factors at play? Could just give us a perspective from Europe.
Thank you very much. And let me also begin by thanking our Georgian hosts for their very warm welcome at this very important moment in time for your wonderful country. And I hope that the transition of leadership in Europe will be good momentum for strengthening the ties. Now on Turkey, let me pick up somewhere where Ambassador Breise left his wonderful and very broad scope introduction about many things I agree with him. And share with you why I switched from being a staunch defender of Turkey's accession to the European Union, a position that is controversial in the Netherlands, controversial in Europe, and has led to a lot of pressure on me personally when I was serving in political office. And we can talk a lot about, you know, the entire dynamics between the EU and Turkey and the many painful lessons learned there, but I would like to pick up where Ambassador Breise left off, which is the refugees. And I think a summary of the situation we're in between the EU and Turkey can be understood when we begin in the year 2016. So in the spring of 2016, the infamous statement on migration was agreed very hastily, basically outsourcing the responsibilities of the European Union to Turkey when it came to sheltering the flows of refugees coming from Syria. Indeed, there are now around 3.5 million of them living in Turkey. And I think that kind of set the tone for the relationship at a moment where the accession process was effectively stalled. There was a lot of disagreement because of the situation in Cyprus, but also because of different political leaderships in the member states and the need to have unanimity to opening new chapters for negotiation. So this new refugee deal was in 2016 hotly debated. I think the majority was happy with it, but certainly there was also a lot of cynicism in the notion that there are floodgates that Turkey can open, a notion that the president of Turkey threatens with until today. Then in 2016, I think an incredibly dramatic event happened, which was an attempted coup in a country that has a very long history with coups, very painful scars from that history. And I think indeed, just like in the United States, many people in Europe did not quite appreciate what had happened, including the bombing of the parliament, including really very, very significant threats to stability in Turkey. And we always said that Turkey has the legitimate right to hold to account the perpetrators, and that, of course, any such military coup attempts should be condemned in the strongest possible terms. However, What we've seen since the failed coup attempt, you know, it goes beyond any kind of imagination. I'm going to just give you some facts and figures. 150,000 civil servants, or approximately, fired. 78,000 people arrested on terrorism charges. 4,000 judges fired. 570 lawyers arrested. The state of emergency extended 7 times, and when it was lifted, a number of measures that were contained in the state of emergency had been taken over by new laws introduced and constitutional changes implemented. Constitutional changes that the Venice Commission of the Council of Europe considers to significantly challenge checks and balances and a separation of powers. And I'll come back to that later. Of course, we know about the many journalists in prison, but I'm not sure whether you're aware of more than 100,000 websites having been blocked in Turkey, including Wikipedia, but also sort of technical websites like GitHub, Google Drive, and others. We have the detention of opposition politicians, the dismissing of mayors, and ongoing arrests and very significant charges against opposition politicians. And when I was listening to the discussions about Georgia over the past couple of days and some people's concerns about the notion of state capture, I think this is a term that really resonates when you think about the situation in Turkey. And so what we looked at in the European Parliament, and I was, for the majority of my time of serving in the European Parliament, the one negotiating the Turkey resolution for my political group, the Liberal group in the Parliament, we said in 2016, or reflecting on 2016, said in 2017 that we were deeply concerned about the erosion of the rule of law in Turkey, and that we recommended a freeze until some of the worst violations of the rule of law had been lifted. And then when that did not happen, and when the constitutional package passed, significantly challenging independence of the judiciary, separation of powers, checks and balances, we actually recommended a suspension of the accession talks. And this is quite a strong statement, but I think it's a justified one. And at the same time, we recommended continuing to work on strengthening and reforming our trade relation through the customs union, but never without anchoring that in conditionality upon respect for the rule of law, human rights, and democratic reforms. I think the discussion on visa-free travel is a very legitimate grievance on the Turkish side and is something we need to continue to work on, but for that, the terror legislation has to be reformed. And lastly, I think maybe one important thing to mention, and then I'll conclude my introductory remarks, is that, you know, all the trust and concern, trust lost and concern about the situation in Turkey was for a long time a foreign policy concern. But especially the aftermath of the failed coup attempt, the referendum and campaigning for it, has really also imported the tensions that we see within Turkish society into our domestic debates, because there are, in a country like the Netherlands, but also in a country like Germany, significant amounts of diaspora, people that trace their roots back to Turkey and that still feel very connected to that country. And we saw things such as snitching phone lines opened by the government of Turkey, where people were invited to tell on and report on each other for their ideas and convictions, something that flies so much in the face of any values that we hold in the Netherlands, that it led to tensions in schoolyards, it led to threats of violence to people, and truly disturbing instances that I believe have created a picture about Turkey that may not always reflect all the complexities, all the strategic interests, from trade to security, from migration to energy and whatnot, but that certainly is very dominant when it comes to how people shape their ideas. It is often more telling how a neighbor is treated than how a border crossing between Syria and Turkey is treated. So I just wanted to end there by saying that while the geopolitical and strategic interests are huge, and we're not naive about that, and I think it's very important that Europe steps up its efforts to deal with those, the rule of law and separation of powers and human rights violations in Turkey are so significant that they must have consequences. If Europe does not attach consequences to these violations, then the promise of being a values-based union are essentially thrown under the bus.
Thank you, Marietta. David, can I ask you, neighbors here in the region, what's the situation, the perceptions of Turkey, would you say, and has the relationship changed in the last few years?
Thank you, and I'd like to thank EPRC, McCain Institute. I've been focusing on this region and visiting Georgia for over 20 years. I thought I had a measure of Georgian hospitality, but the hospitality that Nino and her colleagues showers upon us is really something quite special. I'm also quite thrilled that later today we're going to hear from two wise men, two real giants in American diplomacy, Ambassador Teft and Ambassador Fried, and I look forward to hearing their comments later on. I think that Turkey, like Iran, rushed into the Caucasus and Central Asia after the breakup of the Soviet Union and tried to reconnect through historic and religious and ethnic connections. The United States and other countries came in later with diplomatic relations and technical exchanges and foreign direct investment, mainly in the hydrocarbon sector. But the AK Party came into Turkey in 2002, and I think that shortly thereafterwards, in what we would call a pivot today, Turkey wanted to play its self-described Islamic card and got more interested in the broader Middle East and kind of moved its focus off of the South Caucasus. Armenia has already been mentioned, and obviously the relationship between Turkey and Armenia is very difficult. There was an opportunity in 2009 for something perhaps to happen. It didn't, and I think that relations have hardened both in Ankara and Yerevan as far as a breach in improving relationships there. Azerbaijan, I don't know of many Azeris that like the phrase one people, two nations. They think of themselves as distinct, but of course their linkage in pipelines is dependent on Georgia and Turkey, and Turks have quite an influence in Azerbaijan. But the Azeris are quite specific in making sure that their relationship with Europe, with Israel, with the Gulf states is quite independent of Turkey. And of course we get to Georgia, and it's clear that Turkey has had an economic contribution to Central Asia and obviously to the Caucasus. It's not moving forward the size of China or Russia, but it has, when Turkey's economy has been strong, has been quite good. Now, after 17 years of the AK Party, there's some fragilities in its own domestic politics, and everyone's familiar with the mayoral elections there, the new parties that were started by the former President Gül. But obviously their economy, about $45–50 billion in debt that they're now looking towards China to help out with. They're not looking to try and help out Georgia. So we've always talked about Turkey as having very important strategic geography. Churchill is replete with quotes talking about the importance of Turkish geography from trench warfare, and it still is important today. I think General Brylov mentioned it. But I think what's important kind of going forward is the state of Turkey's economy, the state of Turkey's democracy. Is Turkey able to join with Georgia in one of Georgia's big projects? Is Turkey a partner with Georgia in consolidating its democracy and its democratic institutions? Is Turkey a partner with Georgia in Georgia's ambitions for European and Euro-Atlantic institutions, when Turkey has what I would describe as a hostage negotiation relationship with NATO? It's not looking to build consensus and have its voice heard in NATO, but it's reaching out very, very differently. Its relationship with Putin is alarming to NATO allies, to America. Erdogan has spent more time on the phone and in meetings with Putin than any other leader. I think that it's of concern to Yerevan as far as they somewhat question the validity of Russia as a security guarantor for themselves. So I think moving forward, what's next or what is to be done, I think that it'll be interesting to see, minus the economic muscle that Turkey has played in the region, replaced by China, what role will a Turkey play here when it's more active in Syria, in Iraq, in Libya, and in a battle with Egypt and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states for competition in the broader Middle East.
Thank you, David. Ambassador Williamson, can you talk a little bit about maybe Turkey in the Balkans? Is it a constructive relationship there? Because it comes up also sometimes in terms of concern, but if you could share some of your thoughts about that.
Sure. And as you said at the outset, I might have a little more positive outlook. So I think Matt and I kind of bookend this conversation on a more positive note. I have spent a lot of years working in the Balkans, and I think, and so I am much more familiar with Turkey's role there. But I think some parallels can be drawn from how Turkey has engaged in the Balkans and its potential role in the Caucasus. Just one caveat, when we speak of the Balkans, it is not a homogeneous entity. There's a lot of diversity among the countries. They have very different political and security interests and economic objectives. And in that regard, Turkey has become a leader in foreign investment in the region. Even in a place like Serbia, where just a few years ago, political and military leaders pejoratively referred to their Bosnian Muslim enemies as Turks, kind of summoning up these images of fighting the Ottomans in 1389. But in addition to this economic engagement, Turkey has also become much more involved politically in the region. And I think this has come about for several reasons. Certain countries, particularly Kosovo, Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, have tapped into their historical and cultural ties with Turkey and have welcomed increased Turkish engagement there. In those countries especially, I think they've come to see closer ties with Turkey, not necessarily as an alternative, but as a supplement to their EU aspirations. There is frustration at the pace of EU integration, and I think there are very few people in these aspirant countries who see EU accession as a reality in the near term. And increasingly, you hear people, particularly in Bosnia and Albania, saying that this is because the EU does not want them because they're Muslim countries. And I don't think that this is the driving force behind EU hesitation, but this perception has taken hold there. And they do see increasing ties with Turkey as an important alternative. In terms of how Turkey's role has manifested itself in the region, I think a couple of points. First, Turkey has sought to strengthen political ties and heighten its influence. This is often presented, particularly by Russia, as Turkey pushing an Islamist agenda in the region. I think these concerns are overblown. There are clearly some political figures, particularly in Bosnia, who emphasize this Islamist connection, but I don't think that's the driving force behind Turkish engagement. Turkey clearly sees an opportunity to expand its role, and they're taking advantage of that. But I think ultimately Ankara's overriding interest is for stability in their near neighborhood. And even a more overriding interest is economic ties. As I said a moment ago, Turkey has increased investment in the region. They're continuing to do this. They want a stable region where these economic ties can prosper. So at the end of the day, I think Turkish investment certainly comes with a lot less baggage than Russian investment in the region and the political ties that it brings. So I tend to see Turkey's role much more in alignment with the US and EU in fostering stability there. Clearly there are differences between the US and EU and Turkey, as some of my other panelists have cited, but the interests align much more closely than that of Russia, which is certainly oriented toward fostering instability in the region.
Thank you. Ambassador Yazgan, you had asked to go last. So can I get you to talk a little bit about, has it been a zero problems foreign policy? Has that succeeded, or are we in a multiple problems foreign policy?
Vemer, the question you should ask is, can you stop me talking now? First, thank you very much to all the views that were expressed, and I can see clear interest among the panelists about how to, now what question has to be right, now how can we go further, not back. So this is the starting point. There are some fair comments about our relations, the back ebbs and flows of our relations with the EU and as well as the US. And let me add my perspective, and I will defy my instructions, stay away from my talking points, and let's see what happens. Next year at least. First, I want to refer to the American exceptionalism, which was mentioned. And I'd like to thank the McCain Institute and EPRC for having me on this panel. I tried to bring 4 other speakers who would have taken the seat from me, and I will be speaking there and asking the questions. I failed. Now, there is the idea of Turkish exceptionalism as well. And as the American exceptionalism is sometimes described as exemptionalism, we cannot afford that. A superpower can refer to exemptionalism as that you're not bound by all the values that you advocate. Turkey cannot do that because we're part of that contract of the European values. And that's for, first and foremost, it's not European values, it's universal values. It's Council of Europe, it's there in the UN Charter. And it's not the EU which owns those values, it's the whole European past. That's where Georgia also belongs to. So I do coin this term, EUpeans and Europeans. I do consider myself a European, not a EUpean, and I don't know if I will ever be a EUpean, and I don't necessarily see that I should, different from my talking points. Now, that also leaves me with this issue of what's Turkey's role, our perception of our role, and the perception of the others, what our role should be. If you go on the internet, right, in 2008, a Rand paper about Turkey and what happens next, 2008. They define Turkey's role as the country which should be giving this liberal Islamic view to the region. And it reads Turkey from that perspective. Well, I don't necessarily agree with that, and I never agreed with that. What happened in 2009, 10, 11, where all European and American institutions, politicians were very quiet, is actually what explains what happens today. You go back to the trials where a number of Turkish generals, officers, journalists, for that matter, civil society people were put in prison. We heard no one criticizing from outside. From inside, there was a vibrant criticism and a vibrant struggle, and as of today, we were proven to be right. And in that Rand paper, there are 4 scenarios, one of which is the prediction of a military coup by the military. You know what? The military coup did not happen. A coup happened in Turkey by an organization and network which has 160 country presence, including in Georgia. They have a university whose representatives just spoke. And they are financed from companies in Germany. And the head, as Matt said, is residing in the United States of America, who's our ally. So is there a trust issue? Yes, there is a trust issue. Is that a misperception? No, it's a perception. And now what? Turkey is an investor in Georgia, is an investor in Azerbaijan, is an investor in all the Central Asia, and not through the government policies, to be frank. It's about the vibrant private sector and in Balkans. This is not by design. It's by necessity, by the market economy, by opportunities, and this is natural. The business, the people, the NGOs, they have gone much forward than any governments did, which we are thankful, grateful, because these are the bridges which now keep those relations afloat. And we have to build on that. So when we define interests, I think that's the best part of it. We have to define interest as governments in a way that there will be win-win situation, not 0-1 games, like trying to drive Turkey out of Balkans, out of Caucasus. I read sometimes things like that, and I think, what were they drinking last night before writing that? And I can assure you it's not Georgian wine. Or it's not Slivovice, or because there are opportunities of collective gains. We have to find out about that. And seen as a problem, well, you know what? We don't create the problems. Iraq war was a good decision that we did not go into the Iraq with that given intelligence, which turned out to be a lie afterwards. And in Syria, I'm sorry to say that it's a much complicated story than it is now reflected. And on foreign fighters, I worked for 5 years. I know what went on. About immigration, the President Erdogan, which everybody criticizes in Europe, as I see, for like quote-unquote blackmailing, he's the one who's keeping the Social Democrats, who have won the elections, opposition, from kicking out Syrians. Today, it's a very complicated story. So I will not say that I can explain to you all here in this 5 minutes. Where we go from now is we want to have collective security. Security is indivisible. We want to feel again, like in NATO, like in the OSCE in the 1990s, that my generation were led to believe, that security is indivisible in terms of geography, but in terms of topics as well. You cannot ask for securing your castle and make us pay and then go deal or keep the people who are hurting us in your own countries. Look, 400 people in Germany asked for asylum from the Gülenist organizations. One of them wrote to me on social media, private, direct message. That was a lament that was about, this was the person I worked with, against terrorists, by the way, against ISIL, against radicalization, in the GCTF meetings, in counter-Daesh coalition meetings. This is the person who writes to me, we were misled by this organization, but I cannot go back now. You know why? Because he cannot go back, because he gave national security secrets away. What happens if that happens in any other NATO country? I don't know. So we don't have easy questions and easy answers in Turkey, but some of these questions and answers were not caused by us. We are cleaning after some of our allies and partners, and our warnings in many times were not taken seriously. Now, don't we have any responsibility of what's happening? Is it all our friends and allies' fault, let alone our enemies? No, we have responsibilities. And to be frank, the best way to talk about that responsibilities is in Turkey, together with participation of everybody in the parliament, within the civil society, within that dialogue which is going on. Is that a hard dialogue? Is that hard? Yes. After so much security, we lost like 760 people in 1 year in attacks by PKK and ISIL. And then somebody came out to me and said in one meeting, oh, you know what, you were supporting these Islamists, that's why it happened to you. And 2 weeks later, it was the Brussels bombing. Did I go back and tell them, oh, it's because you've been neglecting your Islamic part or your Muslim society's integration? No, I didn't say that. Because to be frank, that conversation will not help us to answer now what. My suggestion is this. David Merkel talked about the concerns about Russia. The question I asked yesterday had a purpose because I know this was going to come out. We're not the only ones who are talking to Russia. And actually, our talks with Russia are quite to the point about Syria, the security, which concerns us very, very much. It's about our energy security, which concerns us very, very much. And in the meantime, everybody else is speaking. Now, who's speaking about preventing Hezbollah forces in Syria with Russia? Who's speaking? Israel doesn't speak with Russia. United States doesn't speak with Russia. Everybody does. So it depends on how you perceive. I just posted something on the Facebook which says if everybody says something, it doesn't, the majority of people says it, repeats that, it doesn't make it a truth. So what I would say is Turkey's role here in Georgia, we're the first-rate partner. We have big investments. You said joint democracy. There are 400,000 almost people whose mother tongue is Turkic. There are Muslims in this country, but also we have investments in hydroelectric powers. We have constant 3 projects, which Matthew Bryce was part of it, BTC, the Baku-Tbilisi cars, the Middle Road. It's a lot of partnerships. And we want to continue this everywhere. And I think Clint Williamson is very right when he says we are looking for stability around us. And we would like our partners, allies, to listen to us, to our insight, our 1,000-year-old presence here, that how to find that. Thank you.
Thanks. Marietta, would you like to react about the sort of pragmatism versus, or should we open it up to the wider audience? Would you like to say something about that?
Well,
pragmatic relationship versus the sort of security versus values, if you will?
Oh, sure. I mean, there's a lot that I would like to respond to because you lived up to the expectations of talking about a lot of very relevant things. But I think at the end of the day, and truly this is what I think Turks are learning now, if I can be so free as to comment on your country, is that actually these pragmatic coalitions, like the one between the AK Party and the Gülenist movement, have very, very cynical risks entrapped into them. Because I remember personally talking about the arrest of journalists when one of them wrote a book about the risk of infiltration of the state by the Gülenist movement and was put in jail for it. And when I commented on it, and his book was banned, by the way, and I think history has shown us enough in Europe to see that where books are banned, at the end of the day, people will suffer. And it was actually both AK Party supporters and Gülenists who came to me and said that I was wrong, that the pen could be as powerful as the sword, and that we were somehow, not willing to take Turkey seriously and whatnot. And then, of course, when the fallout between the AK party and the Gülenists happened, these same people came to me and said, I'm a journalist, I'm being persecuted for my ideas. And I said, do you remember sitting here 5 years ago? Because actually I do, and it was you who was defending the arrest of your fellow journalists, So there's a lot of lessons there about what pragmatism can lead to. And I think Europe is at a very tricky tipping point when it comes to values. So now I'm going back to just the European Union itself. There's a multi-year budget that's being decided on, right around now, where there's a tendency to instrumentalize foreign policy only for migration management, or with a very, very, very strong priority on migration management, where topics like human rights, democratization, rule of law support are really pushed to the background. And I think for a country like Georgia, that is extremely tricky, because what should be the foundation of our relation, I believe, is this shared set of values and actually a shared concern for violations of international law by big neighbors, restrictions to press freedom, blurring of separations of powers, politicization of state institutions and whatnot. So I personally believe that values are interests and that you cannot separate them, but we are all, I think, in our Western democracies and globally facing the challenges between who is willing to defend those values that have created the quality of life for our people, who's willing to stand for them, while we see them being attacked from the outside, but also from the inside. So I personally believe that there is no sort of pragmatism that's going to have sufficient answers without taking on board the values, foundations upon which they should be built.
Ambassador, if you'd like to react
I
to
hate
that,
to,
then we'll open it up for questions.
And just all things, I forgot to thank the organizers for putting us here as to make this a panel, a real panel, where women also speak. And I am thankful for the open conversation. The pragmatism is not coming out of nowhere. It comes from the EU itself. You're a liberal.
I agree.
Yes, you're a liberal, but there are others. And also from there's realpolitik, which is introduced there. And I'm also against like that deal as yourself. I think it should be a collective responsibility. However, coming back to that issue, this is not an issue of 2016. We're talking about like pragmatism. I remember what the first AK Party was founded, and they started their European perspective, and how they saw that there's this pick and leave approach from the EU, and that was for them. And actually, the Gülenists were very quick to capture the AKP needs, AK Party needs, when AK Party faced party closure risks. So a lot of manipulations there, which we can discuss later on with anyone interested, with yourself as well. However, I can easily tell you that I think values should be not with double standards. You know, Turkey has this feeling, we do our homework, there will be new ones, because they don't want us. Why? Because we're Muslims. You know what, we're not going to convert anytime soon. And we'll be staying Muslims for a long time, and we'll be staying Turks. And Turks is equal to actually many Bosnians, Kurds, Georgians, Arabs, Abkhaz in Turkey. This is how we define Turks in Turkey, not as the ethnic Turks. And this is also different. It's also Turkish exceptionalism as the American exceptionalism. Now, I know that you're impatient, but last thing it's very important to add there. I do agree with many things in sense like in Europe, in Union. European Union does not respond to certain violations in itself. What happened in one country is that they banned headscarf, but kippas and the Sikh turbans are free. You have a rising anti-Islam coming in, and for me, a secular person, I have to defend you, the European, Christian, Jewish, whatever as you define it, which is not actually, but so then I have to define this Islamic liberal democracy connection. So it's a funny place.
Yeah. I'd like to just open it up, unless anyone else on the panel, I'd like to save some time for questions from the audience. Anyone? Any questions about what we've discussed? Pragmatism, Turkey, region? Raise your hands, microphone will come to you.
While they think, can I jump into this?
Please.
One thing that's really struck me about this conference, that's a beautiful thing, is how much time lots of us have spent, especially in our Atlantic Council discussions, trying to coax the political parties together, trying to coax a civilized dialogue with the government here. We all understand that Georgia is so important to us strategically, and it's important because of the unification of values and pragmatic strategic interests. But we're not doing that with Turkey. We don't even have the ambition, it seems, to have that discussion. We seem to, our policy is to squeeze Turkey as much as we can. Consider it not really part of the transatlantic family anymore, even though, thank God, it's still in NATO. So I'm hoping that maybe when we go back to our homes and think about upcoming conferences, maybe we can try to be facilitators of that sort of a dialogue in the same kind of spirit as we're doing here, because Turkey really needs it. And it's possible to do it, even with President Erdogan himself.
Questions? Over there. microphone.
Hello, it's Ketevan Chachawa. I'm from CDD and Sector 3. First of all, thanks to all the organizers and all the speakers for this very interesting opportunity to listen and discuss openly a lot of ongoing challenges, I think, and the now what, I think, is a very relevant question in many aspects. I have a question. Later we're going to talk about NATO enlargement and lessons we have learned. In this context, I think it would be very interesting to talk about with the EU relationship that Turkey has been going through and the latest development or worrying developments that we have been seeing in human rights or in different areas. Maybe this is also something we have to learn from, that actually countries which are very actively striving towards EU, or in our case NATO, and they don't get to the point, or they lose maybe even hope that it is going to get somewhere. Maybe this is actually a big push of going somewhere back, rather than really promoting continuation of going towards more democratization or strengthening human rights. Why I'm asking this, because I think also in the context of Georgia, many times there's question is asked, like, is this going in the right direction? Is this region going to the more towards NATO or EU? Or sometimes we as a civil society also worry that taking us too long maybe, and also there's this strategic patience, but how far we can actually push and hope for wider society having the strategic patience. Thank you.
Anyone on the panel want to tackle that? The question of examples and going forward in progress? Anyone? Mariette?
Sorry, I don't want to dominate the discussion, but I think the question of criteria is really, really important. It's been mentioned by the ambassador, was mentioned this morning by former Secretary General of NATO, Fogh Anders Rasmussen, in the context of NATO. The EU, in its relations with Turkey, whether it's about visa liberalization or whether it's about accession, or in its relations with countries with whom there are association agreements, trade agreements, etc., it puts things on paper. And it means that it's not arbitrary what the criteria are. And I think that this can work in two ways, right? So there have been examples in the past where dates were given to countries that are now members of the European Union when the criteria were actually not met, and we're still paying the price for that. And there have been examples where the date has been postponed, what was referenced by Mr. Lajcek earlier when he said that Jean-Claude Juncker at the beginning of his term said, in the next 5 years, I do not foresee enlargement, which really was a big disappointment for people in civil society who were trying to push for, let's say, oriented towards stronger rule of law and stronger contacts with the European Union were discouraged. And so I would say, and I'm quoting a former foreign minister of Poland, Radek Sikorski here, when he described what his country went through to join the European Union. He said it is extremely difficult and it has to be a national obsession. And I think reforms on the rule of law, reforms on anything that brings a country closer to the European Union should not be underestimated in how difficult it is, but a country can only do it because it believes in it itself. I've had discussions with colleagues of the ambassador in the past who said, well, because the EU didn't give us an accession perspective in the short term, are you surprised that Turkey is not focusing on rule of law reforms and democratization? And I said, no, you didn't say that, but it's, I had these discussions before with people, and it's often said, like kind of chicken or egg discussion, who is to blame for the lack of progress, et cetera, et cetera. But truly, these reforms should come from the bottom up. There is no way, and I think it's also just, an illusion to think that any country from outside can have such influence for such fast reforms in any country. And the examples that we've heard about foreign intervention are often not the best ones, so it has to be bottom-up, broadly supported, multiple stakeholders across political parties, including civil society, et cetera, et cetera.
David, would you like to say a few things?
Just a quick comment on that. I and many in the U.S. government really pushed the EU to move on Turkey's accession and pointed out that Turkey, even if it didn't meet all the criteria, would be a value to the EU. It would point out that it wasn't a Christian club. It would give it a geographic importance, and I think that what's interesting, as far as I'm not exactly sure what lessons were learned. Had the EU moved and accepted Turkey early, would Turkey have taken the steps of the other members, this national obsession, or was it right to go through the very detailed points as they did to kind of identify how serious the government in Turkey were about those principles? It's interesting in that when the Clinton administration invited Russia to join the G8, they said that it was better to have them in the G8 rather than the G7 always talking about Russia. That didn't work out well, so I'm not exactly sure what lessons we've learned in the EU's experience with Turkey.
Thank you, Ambassador. Yeah, go ahead, Ambassador Williams.
Just wanted to add one quick point about this. As we said at the outset, I spent a lot of time working in the Balkans, and in one of my previous capacities as ambassador for war crimes issues in the U.S., I was working with a lot of the Balkan governments in terms of rule of law reforms, cooperation with the International Tribunal for Yugoslavia. These conversations that took place with Croatia were much easier and much more productive because Croatia saw an imminent path to the EU. And so they were able to push through the kind of reforms that have been much more difficult in places like Serbia and Bosnia, where they don't see a realistic path to the EU in the near term. And so it goes back to what Miroslav Lajcak was talking about this morning, these sort of comments about, well, yes, you have a future in the EU, but it's way down the road, does not help. And it certainly does not encourage political leaders in these countries to take hard steps toward reform. Why should they do things that are going to hurt their supporters, hurt their economic interests, impact pensions, all of these sorts of things, when they're not going to see the outcome of this? They're not going to be the ones that are going to get the credit for taking their country into the EU. So there's very little incentive for them to push through those kind of reforms.
Okay, we're almost out of time, so Ambassador.
Something I have to add here, that we have 2 chapters which is not opened with the EU. And those are the chapters which we are criticized most. So, and there is a reason why those chapters are not opened. So if you're going to, in Georgia, what I would suggest is, if you're not ready to open chapters on issues which you criticize on democracy, human rights, the judicial reform, the security, then don't criticize. Because this is the platform. The chapters are the platforms of this cooperation. This is my very personal addition to this discussion. And if you're opening chapters, then come and discuss and say your recipes if there is any. But if not, not opening chapters and constant criticism doesn't help.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. We really do have to end it right now. We'll continue the discussion. Clearly, there's a lot more to be discussed on all of these issues. Thanks very much for everyone, and I think lunch is next, David?
Yes, so thank you very much. Let's give the panel a round of applause, please.